In the heart of Vancouver's most affluent neighborhood, where multi-million-dollar mansions stand proudly and privacy is sacred, a 911 call shattered the quiet night of May 2015. Few could have imagined that what police were about to discover inside that mansion would mark one of the most horrifying family murder cases in modern Canadian history. Dozens of patrol cars immediately surrounded the $8 million house, red and blue lights flashing through the darkness like harbingers of a tragedy waiting to be unveiled. From the outside, the mansion looked like the perfect symbol of the immigrant dream: money, power, and brilliant success. But behind those gilded walls, a family secret had been festering for years, and now it had exploded. To trace the chain of events leading to that fateful night, we need to start with the central figure of this tragedy, Gang Yuan. He was a self-made millionaire born in 1973 in northeastern China. Gang Yuan wasn't born into wealth, but grew up in a family with some capital from the coal mining industry. With a sharp mind and clear ambition, he invested his family's savings to expand their business operations. And within just a few years, he transformed a small company into a multi-million-dollar empire. In 2005, when his wealth was sufficiently established, Gang Yuan decided to leave China and chose Canada as his next destination. He saw new opportunities there, favorable tax policies, a safe investment environment, and most importantly, a ticket to international expansion. But the path to legal residency in Canada wasn't as transparent as people might think. In late 2005, Gang Yuan married a Chinese-Canadian woman, a marriage that was later suspected to be fraudulent. The couple quickly divorced after less than 2 years. Through this brief marriage, Gang Yuan achieved what he wanted: the right to live legally on Canadian soil. With an estimated fortune of $50 million, Gang Yuan owned multiple expensive properties, including a private island, Bentleys, and Rolls-Royces for his staff to use for shopping, and the $8 million mansion where he would meet his tragic end. But no matter how much money he had, he couldn't buy what he craved most. In stark contrast to Gang Yuan's spotlight was the shadow of Li Jiao, a 60-year-old man who always stood on the sidelines of other people's success stories. Li Jiao was born into an educated medical family, but his childhood quickly fell into darkness when political upheaval struck. At age 8, his father was labeled a counter-revolutionary element by the Chinese government and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. After serving his sentence, the man who had once been a doctor returned home but was banned from practicing medicine and ostracized from society. Li Jiao's mother, though she continued working, was also isolated and scorned for marrying a traitor. The family fell into dire poverty. They lived day to day on a single meal, sharing one thin blanket during the freezing winter. Liao, then just a boy, had to endure both hunger and the shame of being the son of a counter-revolutionary. Bullied by friends, isolated, and then heartbroken when his mother died in a traffic accident when he was 11, from then on, the family had no support. At 16, Li Jiao was forced to drop out of school to work as a laborer, working 12 to 15 hours a day, 6 days a week. Most of his income went to supporting his aging father. The pressure accumulated over many years, exhausting him both physically and mentally. One day, overcome with homesickness, he decided to walk 900 meters through snow to return home. When found in a state of exhaustion and delirium, he was admitted to a psychiatric ward and had to be treated with medication for an extended period. It wasn't until adulthood that Li Jiao's life began to show signs of change. Opening a small photography shop with his brothers, he saved enough money to marry Li Jiao, his gentle partner, and welcomed their first daughter, Florence, in 1987. 14 years later in 2001, their family decided to immigrate to Canada, hoping to bring a better future for their only daughter. Florence, Liao's only daughter, was the key piece in this tragedy. Born during China's one-child policy era, Florence was everything to her father. Li Jiao poured all his love, hope, and faith into his daughter, determined to give her a brighter future in Canada, As an adult, Florence quickly became a prominent figure in Vancouver's high society. She appeared on the reality show Ultra-Rich Asian Girls under the stage name Flo.z, where viewers followed the lavish lives of four wealthy young Asian women. The show became a sensation not only in Canada, but also spread to China, making Florence a social media phenomenon, a symbol of the young, wealthy, free, and attractive generation. But behind the stage lights and golden lifestyle, Florence once confided something surprising to her friends. She never felt safe when alone with her uncle Gang Yuan. During one filming session, she told producers directly that she always tried to avoid private contact with him because Gang Yuan brought bad energy to the family atmosphere that she couldn't explain. That vague unease unexpectedly was a painful prophecy because not long after the brutal truth would be exposed. Everything began in 2010 when Gang Yuan invited Li Zhao's family to live together in the multi-million-dollar mansion with the promise of a mutually beneficial business arrangement. According to the plan, Li Zhao would become a partner managing Gang Yuan's farm investments, receiving 1/3 of the profits, while his wife Xiam, Gang Yuan's adoptive cousin, would help with housework. For the Li Zhao couple, this was a golden opportunity to change their lives, to rise from their modest position in Canadian society. But the dream quickly became a nightmare. Throughout 5 years of living under the same roof, Li Zhao never received a single dollar in profit as promised. Gang Yuan not only didn't pay Li Zhao, but also the hired workers at the farm. This was because most of the money was being spent on supporting over 100 girlfriends, mistresses, and young, beautiful sugar babies. In Li Zhao's eyes, the business arrangement had become just an excuse for Gang Yuan to turn him into an unpaid servant. He had to work extremely hard, wasn't respected, and was completely dependent. Worse than the exploitation was the humiliation. Li Zhao witnessed Gang Yuan daily bragging about having numerous illegitimate children, treating women terribly, even physically abusing and insulting lovers who didn't please him. Gang considered himself the center of the world, with no one worthy of more than him, especially those of lower status. For Li Zhao, who had lived a life of silence, endurance, and sacrifice, this wasn't just injustice, but the deepest insult to his self-respect. And so, drop by drop accumulated until the cup overflowed. A family that once thought they had entered paradise of prosperity now only had suppression, anger, and feelings of betrayal. The fuse was ready, and it only needed a spark. Tragedy would explode. May 2nd, 2015 began like any other day in the multi-million-dollar mansion in Vancouver's upscale neighborhood. The morning passed in familiar quiet. Xiaomi and her mother went for their usual walk around the garden, leaving Li Zhao and Gang Yuan alone in the house. But for Li Zhao, that day wasn't ordinary. It was the day he decided to seize his last chance. He had carefully prepared to present a new business plan, something he hoped would open doors to the future, or at least be convincing enough for Gang Yuan to invest after 5 years of hopeless waiting. He didn't come as a servant, but as a man wanting to reclaim his dignity and position in the very house where he was living. But from the very first minutes, Gang Yuan shattered that hope. He sat indifferently, showing no interest in what Li Zhao was saying, constantly interrupting with contemptuous comments, and finally burst into laughter. Laughter that made the atmosphere freeze. For Li Zhao, this was like a final slap. All the resentment buried over 5 years from exploitation, humiliation, and opportunity theft all showed on his face. He could no longer remain calm. For the first time, Li Zhao challenged the unfulfilled promises, demanding the justice he had never received. The entire luxurious room now felt like a pressure chamber, just waiting to explode. And then Gang Yuan made a proposal that would cost him his very life. Gang Yuan's proposal rang out in the room like a naked explosion. Immoral, insane, and completely unimaginable. He suggested that if Li Zhao could arrange for him to marry Florence, he would be willing to give Li Zhao 50% shares in the new business venture. For a few seconds of eerie silence, Li Zhao thought he had misheard. This was an uncle talking about marrying his own niece, Florence, the only daughter Li Jiao loved like his entire life. Although legally there was no blood relationship since Xiaomei was Gang Yuan's adoptive cousin, for many years they had lived like a real family, eating at the same table, living in the same house, calling each other uncle and niece. Florence was then a young woman who had just started a family while Gang Yuan was over 40. Initially, Li Jiao thought this was just a sick joke, but the more he listened, the more chills ran down his spine because Gang Yuan was completely serious. He began rambling that he was ready to hire lawyers to deal with Florence's husband, that at his age, he needed stability, that Florence could help him solidify his perfect media image. Zi naturally objected outright. He said it would never happen, but Gang Yuan didn't stop. He smiled coldly, a smile that no longer hid his true nature, and responded with words that trampled on the self-respect of the man before him. Who do you think you are to have the right to stop me? You're too weak. Gang's final words were like a slap directly to Li Jiao's self-respect. 5 years of silent endurance were now swept away by unforgivable insult. This man not only looked down on Zhao's efforts, but also schemed to turn his daughter into a bargaining chip. Florence was the final boundary he wouldn't let anyone cross. Rage exploded. No longer restrained, Li Jiao began cursing Gang Yuan with the most venomous words. In Chinese culture, he called Yuan worse than an animal, a heavy curse rarely uttered. But Yuan didn't back down. He charged forward and struck Li Jiao first. The situation immediately spiraled out of control. Gang Yuan at 6 trillion tall was much stronger than the small Li Jiao, who was barely 5t tall. In panic, Li Jiao stumbled and ran until his eyes spotted a hammer near the bed. In desperation, Li Jiao grabbed it like a cornered animal. "Don't come closer!" Zi shouted, swinging the hammer toward Gang Yuan, but Yuan just sneered, advancing with contemptuous eyes and taunting. "You don't dare hit me, you're too cowardly." And then, as if all the suppression of his lifetime poured into one moment, Li Jiao swung the hammer, striking directly at Gang's leg. From there, everything became chaotic like a bloody action movie scene. The two men chased each other throughout the mansion, trying to wrestle the hammer from each other, the sound of breaking objects echoing loudly. Li Jiao said they fought all the way to the garage where Gang Yuan collapsed, blood flowing from his wounds, but still not completely down. Gang tried to stand up, his eyes full of murderous intent. Li Jiao feared he would get one of the guns hidden in the house. In a moment of absolute instinct, Li Jiao ran to the safe, pulled out a gun, and pointed it straight at Gang Yuan. "Don't come closer," he shouted. But Gang Yuan still didn't stop. He challenged, mocked, then recklessly lunged forward to grab the hammer. Gunshots rang out, one shot, then two shots. Gang Yuan fell down, never to rise again. However, when the investigation began, Li Jiao's testimony was quickly questioned. Investigators wondered, how could someone with a hammer blow to the leg still be able to chase around the entire mansion? Why didn't Zi call the police instead of continuing this bloody struggle? When the gunshots rang out, Li Jiao's life entered a chapter of no return. Just minutes later, Xiaomei and her mother returned from their morning walk. They entered the garage and immediately faced a horrifying scene. Gang Yuan lying motionless on the cement floor, blood spreading across the floor while Li Jiao stood there trembling, still holding the gun. Xiaomei screamed, "What happened?" But Li Jiao didn't answer. He just breathed heavily, eyes vacant, then ordered, "You two need to leave here immediately. Go as far as possible." That was the first turning point. Instead of calling police and presenting the incident as a desperate act of self-defense, Li Jiao chose to cover it up. And from that moment, every decision he made only dragged him deeper into darkness. After his wife and mother-in-law left, Li Jiao turned back to look at Gang Wen's body, now living evidence of a crime that could result in a life sentence. In shock and chaos, he picked up the hammer again and gently poked Gang Wen's body, not to torture, but to check. Was there still any sign of life? Liao wanted to be sure, but when he saw no more blood flowing, he knew there was no turning back. He began wiping blood stains with towels and brushes, trying to erase evidence from the scene. But the biggest problem remained unsolved. How to move the body of a man over 6 feet tall, weighing more than 200 pounds out of the mansion without being discovered. As someone who had gone hunting, Li Jiao knew a dark truth. Something too big to move must be made smaller. Later, Li Jiao testified that he had processed bear, deer, and wild boar carcasses, large animals. He knew how to use knives to process animal carcasses. And in a state between consciousness and delirium, he began to act. "I kept thinking I was just butchering a bear," he later testified. "I told myself, it's not a person, just an animal." The 911 call at 11:30 p.m. on May 2, 2015 marked the beginning of one of the most shocking family murder cases in Vancouver's history. The caller was Li Jiao's wife, speaking in Mandarin with a trembling, choked voice, revealing the horrific events she had witnessed through panic sobs. Beside her, a man, apparently a family friend, was translating each word into English so the emergency operator could understand the entire story. When asked why she waited 5 hours after discovering the incident to call police, Xiaomei explained that she was completely panicked and didn't know what to do. So she sought advice from a close friend in the Chinese community before deciding to contact police. Upon receiving the information, Vancouver police immediately deployed multiple units to the mansion at 3688 Osler Street, located in the Shaughnessy neighborhood, the city's wealthiest area, where houses worth tens of millions of dollars are surrounded by high fences and tight security systems. Due to the sensitive nature of the area and the possibility that the suspect was still inside, police forces didn't rush in immediately, but chose to surround the entire house, then block access roads and establish a strict security perimeter. The mansion's modern design with glass walls extending from floor to ceiling inadvertently became a divine eye for police forces. From outside, they could clearly observe the entire interior space without needing to enter, and what they saw would become a lasting nightmare throughout many officers' careers. Li Jiao appeared in the dim light of the kitchen holding a meat cleaver, sledgehammer, rifle, and even a chainsaw. The sound of metal clashing, the chainsaw's motor roaring intermittently, echoing through the night made the scene eerie and terrifying. He moved constantly back and forth between the garage and kitchen, dragging bloody plastic bags, washing knives at the sink, and dragging heavy buckets of water if doing familiar manual work. What made police shudder wasn't just the behavior, but the attitude. Between those extended work shifts, Li Jiao calmly sat down to make instant noodles, eating as if nothing had happened. All actions showed patience and calmness to the point of coldness, a composure only found in those who had crossed moral boundaries long ago. At that time, despite having sufficient evidence showing the horror happening inside, police still decided not to raid. They were concerned about the possibility of additional armed suspects or potential hostages held inside the mansion. Moreover, this was Vancouver's wealthiest neighborhood where every police action was under media and political scrutiny. One mistake, however small, could create a fierce wave of criticism. The standoff lasted all night until Liao finally answered the phone at 8 a.m. the next morning, exactly when he was leisurely eating instant noodles in the kitchen beside an unwashed meat cleaver and the chainsaw still stained with blood. The arrest proceeded unusually easily. After talking with a Mandarin-speaking police officer over the phone, Li Jiao walked out of the mansion, unarmed, without resistance. He quietly raised his hands in surrender, his face gaunt and tired. As soon as he stepped outside, the tactical team immediately rushed in, subdued, and handcuffed him in silence. No cries of innocence, no resistance whatsoever, only the cold acceptance of someone who knew it was all over. Police's first task was to sweep the entire house. They had to ensure no one else was threatened, no remaining hostages or other suspects. Every room, every hallway was thoroughly searched. And then when they opened the garage door, the real nightmare began. Police entered one of the most gruesome crime scenes ever witnessed. Scattered throughout the garage were dozens of plastic bags containing body parts with a total of 108 severed pieces, each in different conditions. Some were stuffed in freezers, others scattered on the cold concrete floor, still dripping blood. The cutting, sawing, and knife marks showed inconsistent dismemberment techniques, making forensic experts unable to immediately determine the motive or sequence of the dismemberment. Police immediately sealed the crime scene. A special investigation team and forensic experts were called into work through the night. Each plastic bag was numbered, each body part carefully preserved for case reconstruction. What happened in this house was no longer an ordinary murder, but a shocking tragedy requiring both the legal system and forensic medicine to intervene. After being arrested, Li Jiao officially faced justice. A trial lasting nearly 2 years was opened, attracting media attention across Canada and China. At trial, defense attorneys presented an argument focusing on human factors rather than crime. They asserted that Li Jiao had no intention of killing Gang Yuan, that the incident resulted from an emotional explosion after years of oppression, insult, and especially after threats against his daughter, the only sacred thing left in his life. They called it an impulsive act of defense, not premeditated murder. Therefore, the defense requested the court reduce the charge from first-degree murder to manslaughter. This was a life or death difference. Manslaughter carries no minimum sentence, while premeditated murder could lead to life imprisonment. With this argument, they hoped the court would understand the circumstances and emotional desperation that drove Li Jiao to action. But the prosecution didn't accept that explanation. Legal representatives for Gang Yuan's family fiercely countered, arguing this wasn't simply a case of lost emotional control, but the consequence of long-simmering financial conflicts. They emphasized Li Jiao had been deceived by UN in business deals, denied wages, and treated like a lowly servant in the very house where he lived. According to them, Li Jiao had harbored resentment for years, and at some point, he could no longer endure it. The prosecution accused Li Jiao of not only murder, but also carrying out a series of subsequent actions to cover up the crime, including dismemberment, identity fraud, and manipulating the victim's social media. Through each of these actions, they argued Li Jiao had secretly planned the attack. This case quickly became an international media phenomenon, attracting attention from both China and Canada. A Chinese-Canadian millionaire murdered and dismembered in his own mansion. That setting was enough to captivate the public. But beyond the crime, the story contained every element that made public opinion unable to look away. Money, family disputes, cultural prejudices, and a controversial inheritance. However, international media, especially in Canada, seemed to sympathize more with Li Jiao. In numerous articles and analyses, Gang Yuan's image wasn't portrayed as a simple victim, but as a controversial figure. He was described as someone with a lavish lifestyle, accustomed to spending money frivolously on hundreds of romantic relationships with a list of girlfriends and sugar babies so long it couldn't be verified. Many sources also suggested Gang Yuan had been involved in shady financial dealings in China and had left his homeland to avoid investigation for corruption allegations. Gang Yuan's $50 million estate immediately became the focus of a legal battle. Dozens of women appeared one by one claiming to have children with him. After DNA testing conducted by Canadian courts, 5 children were confirmed as Gang Yuan's biological offspring, and they were eligible to inherit according to law. Meanwhile, some people, especially in Vancouver's Chinese community, expressed sympathy for Li Jiao, seeing him as a father driven to desperation, acting out of fear that his daughter would be harmed. They didn't see him as a murderer, but as a victim of a toxic patriarchal system and an unbalanced power relationship. But on the other side, many people felt outraged by the case's brutality. The fact that Gang Yuan was dismembered into 108 pieces, a number that shocked even experienced investigators, was seen as an action far beyond the bounds of justified self-defense. Many couldn't understand how a man could maintain the composure to process a body for so many hours. Until his arrest, Li Jiao had never had a criminal record, and in the eyes of those who knew him, he was always a quiet, kind, and gentle person. His life passed in silence with no signs that he could be involved in such a horrific crime. And then, after nearly 5 years of tense litigation, the final verdict was announced in October 2020. The British Columbia Supreme Court concluded that Li Jiao was not guilty of first-degree murder as originally charged, but of manslaughter and unlawful interference with human remains. With this charge, he was sentenced to 10 years and 6 months in prison with possible early release due to time already served in pretrial detention. The presiding judge declared that although there were many questionable points in Li Jiao's testimony, especially inconsistent details about the conflict, the court didn't find sufficient evidence showing he had premeditated murder. More importantly, Li Jiao had shown genuine remorse throughout the trial process, and this greatly influenced the final verdict. However, the victim's family received the verdict with outrage. Gang Yuan's representative lawyer couldn't hide his disappointment when responding to the press. Given the level of brutality and how the victim was killed and the body was handled, I think this verdict will surprise many people. What do you think about this case? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for following along and see you in the next.